Hey guys, Peter here to tell you about the latest from Wiegedood, There's Always Blood at the End of the Road, out January 14th on Century Media Records. This album has 9 tracks, 44 minutes in length, and this is the band's 4th full-length studio album. They are a Belgian black metal band. For this record, they created an album that's very compact, perhaps one of the most compact records that I've heard in recent time. There's really no breaks. It's an album that comes at you and it grows with every single song, and it doesn't matter how much you run away from it, it always finds a way of catching up to you. So while having nuances from song to song and within songs themselves, when you get to the end of the record, those nuances are kind of disappearing or at least integrating themselves into the overall intensity of the record, and the album becomes a little bit murky, making it very hard for the listener to be able to tell the forest from the trees. That's the kind of nature that this album puts together as far as its structure, as far as its creation. The only exception to that point is the song Wade, an instrumental interlude track under the 2-minute mark that really gives you a little bit of a break, a sense that you can catch your breath and then get ready for the onslaught that comes after. A very different track from everything you heard up until that point and everything you're going to hear from that point forward. The album could have used a few more songs like that. It would have expanded the album, it would make the record feel a little bit bigger, but it would also create more fluidity and make the album more dynamic, a little bit easier to digest. The way it stands is very robust. When you get to the end of this album, you feel full, you feel satisfied with your experience. I don't think you're necessarily ready to go back at it again. You really need some time to walk it off before you re-engage with this album once again. It just has a lot to give, and it gives it to you without pauses or breaks. That to me becomes a little bit of a downside of this album. Once you get into the soundscape, this album is visceral. It's visceral in the vocals, it's visceral in the sound, it's visceral in the way it's created, and that kind of becomes a calling card of how this record comes together. The sound feels raw, feels natural, feels organic. It's definitely not polished. It's a natural sounding black metal record. When you think of the origins of the genre, when you think about the brutality, when you think about the intensity, the emotions that come through this specific genre, all of that is packed into this record with different amounts, with different measures depending on which song you're in, but throughout the entire album, that's exactly what you're going to get. So this is an album that really expresses well what the musicians were feeling when they created it, because the sound feels as raw as the emotions that they're trying to portray with these songs. The sound has that brutality to it. You feel those rugged edges at every single turn, and that really becomes one of the defining elements of the soundscape and the atmosphere that soundscape creates throughout this entire album. Within that sound, you have 2 elements that, in my opinion, really drive the experience or put a stamp into what the experience of this album is all about, and that is the drums and guitars. I love the drums on this record. I was actually expecting them to be a little bit more hollow considering the overall rawness of the album, but they weren't. They had a little bit more depth, they had a little bit of soul and a heartbeat to it, and they walked perhaps in a different direction from the rest of the sound of the record, but that allowed the album overall to feel even bigger, to have even more of a potent fingerprint and make this album as powerful as it is. I just love how they sound, how they were executed. The depth that they give to the songs in the overall soundscape is magnificent. On the other hand, you have the guitars, and if there's one element on this album that dictates the speed, that dictates the direction in which the listener is going to go, in which the songs are going, is definitely the guitars. They bring in melody, they bring in force, they bring in drive, they dictate the momentum of the songs, they drive the listener into the right directions, they drive the songs into the right directions, and it really becomes the motor of the entire album, offering different looks, different feels, different approaches, sometimes a little bit more rugged, sometimes a little bit more polished, always creating the necessary ebbs and flows from songs to songs and within songs themselves. On top of all of this, you have visceral vocals. This is really the word of this album, visceral. The vocals really feel penetrating. They cut deep. They really cut deep through this entire album, and they cut deep through the listener once you're experiencing this record. They add to the atmosphere of the album. They feel more like an instrument and less just like vocal lines. They really create ebbs and flows. They create the necessary connection with the sound in order for everything to come together. They're the final element that brings this album to life, and you see a lot of movement as far as the vocals are concerned. They're always driven, they're always penetrating, but it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all from beginning to end. There are a few nuances, there are a few elements that change from track to track that allow them to keep some of their DNA together, to keep some of that DNA intact, allowing the album to have a sense of continuity, but at the same time allowing themselves to change ever so slightly to better match, to better fit the dynamic of the individual tracks. Overall, this is perhaps one of the rawest albums that I've heard so far this year. I know we're earlier in the year, but this album really sets the tone as far as black metal and old school black metal sound is concerned. It's very raw, it's ground, it's from the ground up. It feels visceral, like I said, it feels organic. It really matches what the artists had in mind when they were creating it. It feels like the natural sequence without any filters, without any borders, without any restrictions. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with Until It Is Not. A track that is driven, it has melody, it has drive, it's heavy. It starts off with a sense of direction immediately. You know exactly where you're starting and where you're going to go with this track. The vocals add to the overall sound experience, once again, becoming another element, becoming another instrument. The track changes the angles in which the song is coming at you, but it never really stops from coming at you. It just feels like it's coming from different places, but always with the same intensity, always with the same drive. It has a lot of rage built into the darkness that it carries and then into the melody that it's put forward. It allows itself to create fingerprints of sound and create fingerprints that are really defined throughout the entire track. You can really see the ebbs and flows. While being slight ebbs and flows, you can still see the ebbs and flows as you progress throughout this entire song. Soul-piercing vocals coming together to really unifying this overall experience and this overall track. Next we have Theft and Begging, demolishing both musically and vocally from the start. There's no intro, there's no slowing down, there's no tipping your toes into the waters. It's brutality from the get-go, both musically and vocally. A giant wave of sound that feels like it's getting bigger and bigger with every passing minute. That's how this song comes together. The guitars also come in waves, like the tide coming in into the shore, pulling back out. It has this movement to it that I really enjoyed, that I really appreciated. It allowed me to better digest this track musically because it had some movement. It didn't feel like it was flatlined all the way through. It allows also to create perhaps a little bit of a deeper atmospheric moments within the song. They're ever so slightly built into the track. They're like layers within it, but it's there to be able to be enjoyed and to better define the overall sound and experience. Both musically and vocally, this is a very intensive track, has a lot of intensity to it. There's the middle portion of the song that kind of breaks the track down. It allows you to kind of ease yourself into it. It feels more atmospheric, it feels more melodic, it feels more stripped down. It starts to peel the layers off, and this is a necessary break for a track that had this intensity at the start. Now once you're over that desert hump there, the song goes back into how it was at the beginning, going full circle, finishing as strong as it started. But that middle portion is really interesting because it deprives you of all the emotions and all the sensations that you had earlier and then you're going to have after, allowing them to be magnified by that stripped down portion of the track. Last but not least, Carousel. This is the last song on the album, and it's a song that feels completely different from everything that you heard up until this point. And because of that, it sits well at the end of the album because it doesn't break the routines of the record. It doesn't break the fluidity that the album had all the way through across the previous 8 songs. So it's a track that has a little bit more atmosphere than the previous tracks, or at least you're able to better digest and appreciate that atmosphere. And then the vocals are completely different from everything that we've seen up until this point. It feels more like a chant. It feels more like an enchantment, like a choir, like a singing, a prayer, if you will. And that adds a different dynamic to this track. That moves this track in a completely different direction. If anything, it moves it even deeper into darkness. You start to find this dark hole and you start to navigate through it and going deeper and deeper and deeper with every passing minute. And the vocals play a huge role into that because they feel completely different from before. They're not as visceral, they're not as cutting deep, they're more guiding your experience and not necessarily taking you there. This is it. Wiegedood with There's Always Blood at the End of the Road, out January 14th on Century Media. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.